Long ago, in the beautiful land of Israel, there was a boy named David. He was the youngest of 8 brothers and spent most of his time taking care of his family's sheep. David loved his quiet days in the fields, playing his harp and singing songs of praise to God. Though he was small and young, his heart was full of courage and faith. Far from David's peaceful pastures, a great battle was brewing. The Philistines, enemies of Israel, had set up camp on one side of a valley, while King Saul and the army of Israel were on the other side. The two armies were at a standstill because of one terrifying man, Goliath, a giant of a warrior who towered over everyone. His armor sparkled in the sun, and his spear was so enormous it seemed impossible for a normal man to lift. Every morning, Goliath stomped into the valley and roared, "Choose a man to fight me. If he defeats me, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you will become our slaves." The ground seemed to shake with his voice. The Israelite soldiers froze in fear every time they heard him. Day after day, Goliath shouted his challenge, and no one dared to step forward. Meanwhile, back at home, David was tending his sheep as usual when his father, Jesse, called him. "David," Jesse said, "take this bread and cheese to your brothers at the battlefield. Find out how they're doing and bring me news." Excited for the chance to see the action, David quickly packed up and set off. When he arrived at the camp, he found the Israelite soldiers whispering nervously. Suddenly, a loud voice echoed through the valley. David turned to see Goliath stomping out again, shouting his usual challenge. "Why is no one fighting him?" David asked, confused. "Who is this giant to insult the armies of the living God?" His brothers overheard him and frowned. "David, stop asking questions. Go back to your sheep. This is no place for kids." But David ignored them. Instead, he went to King Saul and said, "I will fight Goliath." King Saul looked at David in disbelief. But you're just a boy, and Goliath is a seasoned warrior." David stood tall and spoke with confidence. "Your Majesty, when I'm taking care of my father's sheep, I fought off lions and bears. God protected me and gave me the strength to defeat them. He will do the same now." King Saul, moved by David's faith, agreed to let him try. He offered David his own armor, but it was far too big and heavy for the young shepherd. David tried to move in it but nearly fell over. "I can't fight in this," David said, taking it off. "God will protect me. That's all I need." David picked up his slingshot and chose 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream. With his simple weapon and unshakable faith, he walked into the valley to face the giant. When Goliath saw David, he threw back his head and laughed. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" he sneered. "Come here, boy, and I'll feed your flesh to the birds." But David didn't flinch. He looked up at the giant and said, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Today, he will hand you over to me, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Enraged, Goliath charged at David, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground. But David didn't run. He reached into his pouch, took out a stone, and placed it in his slingshot. With a quick prayer, he swung it over his head and let it fly. The stone whizzed through the air and struck Goliath square in the forehead. The giant stopped, his eyes wide with shock, and then fell to the ground with a thunderous crash. Silence fell over the valley as everyone stared in disbelief. David ran forward, picked up Goliath's massive sword, and held it high. The Philistines, seeing their mighty champion defeated, turned and ran in terror. The Israelite soldiers cheered loudly and charged after them, chasing them out of the land. When David returned to the camp, he was greeted as a hero. But David didn't take credit for the victory. He lifted his hands and said, "This wasn't my victory. It was God's. He gave me the strength and courage to face the giant." From that day on, everyone in Israel knew David was special, chosen by God for great things. But David remained humble, returning to his sheep and continuing to praise God through his music. Moral of the story. David's story reminds us that no matter how small we may feel or how big our problems seem,